Hello and welcome once again to a special bonus episode of the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne.
And today we are very pleased to have a special guest with us, Luthor Obrock.
Luthor is assistant professor in the Department of Historical Studies and the Department for the Study of Religion at the University of Toronto. His area of research focuses on Sanskrit poetry in the second millennium, especially on the literary and cultural place of Sanskrit in the Sultanate period, that is, during the first centuries of Muslim rule in South Asia. And he's also an avid reader of the Mahabharata since his undergraduate days. Welcome, Luthor.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's so exciting to have you and to have somebody who knows what they're talking about with this text.
Unlike us, you know.
You've had a chance to listen to our main conversation by now. Did our anxiety come through enough?
Look, I've been reading the Mahabharata now for probably 10 years, and I haven't read all of it. So I say, it's something that you keep coming back to. So
there's certainly enough of it to keep you going. That's interesting. How did you first find the Mahabharata, and is that what got you into Sanskrit, or were you already studying Sanskrit at that point?
It's kind of a funny story because a lot of people ask, how did you get interested in Sanskrit? So the answer to that is the Mahabharata. And then there's another question that no one ever asks, which is, why do you keep studying Sanskrit? And the answer to that one is also the Mahabharata. But basically, I took a class on a whim my freshman year of undergrad, and it was called Religious Aspects of Modern Indian Literature. And, we read a number of really interesting books. And after the course, I went to the professor and I said, this is fascinating. I really like this. What other courses could I take? And he said, actually, this really isn't my area of specialization. I'm a scholar of the Mahabharata. If you're interested in that, we could read that. And he just kind of offered. And that was Professor James L. Fitzgerald, who is the translator of the 12th book of the Mahabharata and one of the world's great Mahabharata scholars. So I got in on the ground floor, and we did an independent reading in the Mahabharata in translation. And then I started taking Sanskrit with him, and I've never looked back. So basically, this is the text that got me very much into Sanskrit, South Asian literature.
How fortuitous.
I know, it really was. It really was. It changed the shape and the course of my life.
What was it about the Mahabharata that got you so excited by it?
I had come out of a youth where I was very interested in literature, especially, classical literature, mythology, Greek, Latin, that sort of thing. So I just kind of assumed that it was going to be like the Iliad or the Odyssey, because you hear this word, the Mahabharata, the epic of, South Asia or whatever. And then when reading it, it really wasn't. There were some things that seemed to resonate, but then so much of it was just so new. And I just remember reading the first book, the book of the Adi Parvan, the book of the beginning, and being totally bewildered and just ensorcelled, if that's a word. I just kept on wanting to figure this out and read it more. Like, what is going on here? And it became somewhat of an obsession, really.
That's so interesting, because the experience of bewilderment that you describe, resonates with what we were describing, when Chris and I were talking together. And I'm really interested in, you were saying you had a background in sort of Greek and Latin mythology, and to some extent that inflected your horizon of expectation in encountering the Mahabharata. And we were thinking about that, to some extent we have to meet books where we find them and from where we are, right? We come at them from a position, we come at them from a certain cultural environment. And yet it's problematic, right? Because there are all kinds of limitations and baggage that come with that. Is that something you've reflected on as well? That it's not part of your cultural formation, yet you've lived with it for many years. So it has become part of you in a way.
I think that's exactly it, because in some ways it seems so foreign in some ways, but then the more you're with it and the more you embrace it, it becomes so relevant, I think, and so profound in a way that, resonates with a lot of things, but also questions a lot of other things as well. I mean, I know you were talking in some ways, two things that come to mind are the Christian Bible and the Greek Iliad, because the Greek Iliad is this war epic and the Christian Bible is this scriptural kind of compendium. And in some ways, the Mahabharata is both of these things. But in another way, it works in a very different sort of way. So, what is this text trying to do? How does it work? And in some ways, asking those questions also cycles back, at least for me, and helps me think through something like the Iliad or the Christian Bible and puts it in new sorts of light. So I find the study of literature from this perspective can be really mutually illuminating.
Yeah, one of the things we didn't get to talk about, which was really in my mind, was, the complicated opening where it's kind of layered, who's telling the story, and the story is sort of passed on from person to person until we figure out, like it kind of flows through channels, almost like water. I kept thinking back to Plato's Symposium, where we also have a kind of a highly nested chain of transmission that's a little bit confusing, and you have to really tease it apart. And students and readers are always like, what is that doing there? What is that for? And we didn't get to talk about this last time, but I'd love to know what you think about it. Like, what is that layered opening? What is going on there as we enter into the text?
I actually think Plato's Symposium might be an interesting kind of comparison here in a certain way, in that I think when you look at a Platonic dialogue, or Socratic dialogue, you're going to a place. You go through a series of positions, and then you kind of get to a place. Whereas I think in the Mahabharata, that's not exactly how it works. We're not just trying to get to a final place. Rather, it's this journey of negotiations that becomes so important. So, as you mentioned, the beginning of the Mahabharata is quite striking and strange. The Mahabharata is being recited by somebody who heard it being recited at a snake sacrifice.
I know.
Which is King Janamejaya. His father was killed by a snake, and he vowed revenge on all the snakes. So he does this kind of black magic ritual in which all of the snakes are being pulled through some sort of almost black magic into the sacrificial fire, and they're kind of hanging in midair. It's a very spooky sort of vibe, if you will. And right when the king of snakes, this guy named Takshaka, is going to be sucked into the fire, the snake sacrifice gets stopped. And at that moment, the Mahabharata begins to be recited. Mm-hmm. And what's kind of amazing about that is that we have the story of the Mahabharata, which is basically a apocalyptic war in which, spoiler alert, everyone dies. Well, I mean, there's a few survivors at the end, but then the Mahabharata continues to show their deaths. But we have this moment in the snake sacrifice where this almost complete destruction of the snakes is stopped. And then this text comes in. So it's almost this meta commentary on the way in which violence and destruction is never complete. And that we always have to there's no final solutions, as it were. There's no war that's going to end all wars. There's no act of violence that will wipe out violence, this sort of thing. And also the interesting chain behind the snake sacrifice is that the snake killed Janamejaya's father. But the reason why the snake killed Janamejaya's father is because of a curse against his father. And even that it was
the snake's obligation, right?
It was the snake's obligation. And even before that, Janamejaya's great-great-great-grandfather, Arjuna, killed a bunch of snakes with Krishna in a forest. So all of this ties back in a way that lets you see the way in which acts resonate through history and obligations and cycles. It's very interesting.
And these incredibly complicated chronologies, right? Like even the way in which the story is retold, right? So when we're hearing about how the story was recounted in the context of the snake sacrifice, it's recounted not by Vyasa himself, but by one of his followers, right? Because he doesn't even recite it himself. So it's almost like, I don't know, the story is flowing out of all these different mouths, kind of, but it has its own external reality, kind of.
And also, I mean, if you want to talk about the nestedness of the narrative, the author of this is Vyasa,
who's also a figure in the narrative.
Well, he's also the father of the founders of the two main divisions. So he's the father of Dhritarashtra and he's the father of Pandu.
That's really interesting. And one of the things that makes me think of is also correct me if I'm wrong, but what I understand is sort of the way that this text as we have it was created, where it was being told and then sort of being added to and being recontextualized, and more stories were being put into it over centuries until we have something like what we've got now, that there's this sort of continual encrusting of narrators and tellings that was in the creation and therefore is reflected in the text itself into how it's presenting itself as being transmitted.
Yeah. Now, I should flag right at the beginning that this is a matter of scholarly debate. There's a certain camp that says no, this is a creation of one person or group of people at a specific time in history, and then there's another scholarly opinion that says no, this shows a long process of redaction, addition, other sorts of processes. Now, I'll put my cards on the table. I espouse the second view, but yeah, I do think like the complicated nature of the text itself, the various poles in this, what it's trying to negotiate, I think also speaks to that, like the difficulty of making a text that stands in history.
You can almost kind of strike between those two views in a sense, right? Because there's always a moment of kind of codification where book structures are imposed and so on. So, for example, when we talk about, like we were talking about the Iliad earlier, there's a period of time in Alexandria when people, give it its structure into books and put commentary traditions on it and so on. Does something similar happen with the Mahabharata, like in the 4th century?
Yeah, this is the kind of this is a certain sort of theory which I also largely follow, which would be that in the Gupta Empire, which is 4th century in South Asia, there's the kind of codification of this, there's the redaction of this into the text that we more or less have these days, and that it speaks to a particular model or imagination of dharma, of kingship, of polity, of scripture, of priests and the priestly caste, the Brahmins, and I think I think we can locate it in that sort of moment. Yeah.
One of the things I was wondering about was your thoughts on translation. Like, I know you're working in the Sanskrit space, but you teach the text, and I assume it must be to students who are just reading it in English as well. What do you think about like the incredible task of the translator with this text? Because it's always ever just going to be an adaptation. I mean, there's, other than the huge multi-volume prose translations, it's always going to be some sort of counterpart or reflection of the original.
Yeah, I think that this is such a a good and difficult question because, again, in terms of teaching it, I've taught it through various translations, and then I find myself also translating it when I am in the classroom. I like to tell the stories in a way that I think is compelling, and so you can see how this story was so popular because it almost demands this sort of retelling constantly at different moments. And I should also add that the Mahabharata is incredibly productive in terms of translations and reimaginings. For instance, in the Mughal court, there was a Persian translation of this called the Razumnama that was really, really fascinating. And then even in modern day, there are constant retellings, reimaginations of this. There's a very popular TV serial of this in the late 80s. And this, you see, it constantly demands translation. And I think that's also part of its power.
Yeah, we found that there was a 1989 film, there was a stage play, both of those by Peter Brook, and also an apparently not very good 2013 Hindi language computer animated version. I don't know if you've seen it.
I haven't seen that. I've heard about it.
And graphic novels and cartoons and everything.
Yeah, and I mean, there's this amazing play that was made right after the partition of India, after British India got its independence, kind of reflecting on violence, called Antayug, the Blind Age. And I mean, that was another just beautiful use of the Mahabharata to think through large political issues. So yeah, it constantly retains its relevance, I think.
So we talked a lot about things that we read and particularly enjoyed in our episode. And I'm wondering if there's any particular favorite scenes or characters that we didn't talk about that you want to shout out here.
Oh, I mean, there's so many good characters in this. But I had listened to it, and you had touched upon, Karna, that beautiful and very tragic story, and Arjuna and Krishna. But I think one of my characters that I find fascinating is actually the character that I would argue is at the center of the Mahabharata. It's a guy named Yudhishtira. And Yudhishtira is Arjuna's older brother, and he's the king. He's the heir on the Pandava side of things. And he is a partial incarnation of the god Dharma himself. And I find him really fascinating because it's through Yudhisthira that we see the difficulty of ruling dharmically. So he was one character that I thought I'd like to, bring up a little bit, because he's also the character that in many ways, after the war, has to put together the pieces of the kingdom. He's the one who receives the instruction on what it means to be a good king after the war, in the massive book called the Shanti Parvan, which is the Book of Peace, which takes up about 1/4 of the entire mass of the Mahabharata is one book, book 12. But it's more than just peace, it's pacification is what it means. So like, how do you pacify this war? And in this, you see Yudhishtira constantly trying to be good, be dharmic, and the difficulties behind all of that. So I thought he was a really interesting character, and also to talk about dharma itself through him.
Yeah, could you talk more about that? Because we talked about it a bit, but again, from a position of really just gradually coming to an understanding. And this is something you've thought about and lived with for a very long time.
Well, yeah, and I mean, and again with the Mahabharata, this is always a difficult thing, knowing where to start with this. But I was going to start with a story with another character whose name is Ani Mandavya. I don't know if he made it into your story.
I don't think so.
He's Mandavya. He's the guy with the stake. So basically, he's an ascetic, and he's taken a vow of silence. And a bunch of thieves run through, and he sees them, but he takes a vow of silence. And then they run off. And then the king says, where did those guys go? He's taken a vow of silence. He refuses to talk. And then the king impales him for not following his rules. But he's a great sage, so he somehow survives being impaled. So he's walking around with a big stake through the center of his body, and he curses the god Dharma. And he demands an audience with Dharma, and Dharma says, well, when you were a kid, you used to impale bugs on little pieces of grass. So this is your karmic retribution. Sorry. And Ani Mandavya says, that's absolutely not fair. How can you say what I did as a kid matters this amount? So I curse you, Dharma. I curse you to be born as a human.
I wouldn't think you could do that.
Oh, you can. Oh, no. This is the other thing. Like gods, you can curse gods. Gods get cursed all the time. This is why a lot of these people, these gods are born on Earth. Because there's not this absolute distinction between gods and men, we'll find. They're constantly going in and out. So the interesting thing, though, is that in this interaction, Dharma gets loosened a little bit. Like, you can't apply the same rules to children. It doesn't make sense. And also, Dharma also has to become human. And so this is an interesting beginning point to see how this all works out. So now we have Dharma in the body of Vidura. This is when Dharma gets born as Vidura, by the way. He's cursed as a low status person, a Shudra, to live and try to figure out, and he becomes the embodiment of Dharma, which is interesting. In his embodied life, he's not a member of the upper classes, the upper caste. He's this Shudra person born having a low birth. And so, I don't know, for me, it's very interesting in that we have Dharma coming to Earth, he himself is part of this larger negotiation that is happening in the Mahabharata in terms of Dharma.
Yeah, we found that so interesting too, because like, again, in books we're accustomed to, there's gods over here and personifications over there, but in this world, that line is porous, right? Yeah,
and there's really only one god who actually matters, and that's Vishnu Krishna in terms of the Mahabharata, because other gods get cursed and you can get boons from them, or the line is much more blurred and transactional, I would say. So for instance, Karna, the figure that you had mentioned, he has this gold. He's born with gold armor and earrings, and at one point, the Pandavas say, "We'll never be able to beat him with that power that he has, the sun god's armor." So Indra basically tricks Karna to give away his armor to him as a Brahmin, because they know that Karna will never refuse to give. That is, so his greatest virtue becomes his downfall, because he actually cuts the armor off of his body to give it to a Brahmin.
One of the things we wondered about, but we didn't really discuss explicitly, was the focus on the warrior caste, the Kshatriya caste. Mm-hmm. Brahmins are here, but they don't seem to be at the center of things. Can you talk about that? Or are we understanding that right?
I think you're right to flag this in a certain way. And I think it's interesting to talk about the relationship between the Kshatriyas and the Brahmins in this book, because this is in many ways, a story of a Kshatriya war. But it's also a question of righteousness in a way that demands the input of the Brahminical caste. It is about the Kshatriya class, but it's how the Kshatriya class can live in a Brahminical society in a certain way. So the Brahmins are always there, and the Kshatriyas are always, doing certain sorts of sacrifices or whatever that brings them in. But yeah, it is, I don't know, I do find this rather interesting that it is a kind of exploration of kind of Brahminical society through this Kshatriya lens.
Was it intended for Kshatriya readership?
The Mahabharata sells itself as the Veda for everybody, even Shudras and women, is what it says at the beginning, that it has something for everyone. And I think it is made for a group outside of narrowly religious and ritual concerns, which had traditionally been the scope of the Brahmins. It's a kind of broadening of that.
I wonder if that accounts for its incredible openness to adaptation in a whole range of forms, that it opens itself out to a wide range, to people in all different places within the social order.
Yeah, and I think I do think that this is encoded in this very DNA, if you will. But then again, it does have a very strong ideological vision. So for instance, I mean, that the story that you mentioned of Ekalavya, where he cuts off his thumb, I mean, it seems like in the translation that you read, they gave it more time. They let it they said like, oh, this was a terrible thing. We'd like to imagine that he does this. That's not in the text.
I wondered. Yeah.
Yeah. The text itself is very categorical. It stops there.
See, I could tell because I'm like, the translator clearly feels really bad about this. And I'm like, I don't know if this book actually feels that bad about what's happened.
No, I don't think it does either, because in some ways the Mahabharata is trying to figure out ways to place people in a certain way. The concern in the Bhagavad Gita is swadharma, one's own dharma. So where does your own dharma lie on this continuum of different sorts of duties? And, Arjuna is a warrior. His is to fight, which in some ways is a rather disturbing sort of positionality, because basically, I mean, if you think about it in a really visceral way, God incarnate on earth is telling you to kill your grandfather.
Mm-hmm.
I think the point of it here is for it to be visceral, that this is the edge experience. Just as war is the edge experience of social relations, this is the kind of edge experience of even that. How can you do this?
And it's something that happens not only to an exemplary warrior like Arjuna, but also to the most humble people. I'm reminded of this one moment where, I can't remember the exact scenario, but there's members of a family. One of them is going to have to go off and sacrifice themselves. And the father, the mother, the son, they all talk about it. And the daughter says this. She says, I should go. She says, a daughter should be like a boat to save its parents in life and afterlife. Sacrifice me, who anyway will be sacrificed sooner or later. And so there too, not just a female, but like a young female, right? It is also in that same position.
Yeah. I think, these are the kind of ethical questions that the Mahabharata deals with. And we might not find it satisfactory because it's kind of the opposite of the 10 Commandments. There are no 10 Commandments here. There are how does one live righteously? And how do you make difficult choices that are going to end in violence or death or pain or suffering? This is the kind of questions that I think the Mahabharata doesn't shy away from by saying thou shalt not kill when you read the book of Judges and it's just killing after killing after killing. So I think it tries to negotiate this in a oftentimes very sophisticated, whether or not we accept it or not, but very, very deep sort of way.
I was struggling with what kind of language to use to talk about that. I found myself trying to use the word ethical, and I'm like, ethical does not seem to be the right word here to describe how choices are being framed. But I didn't have the language for it.
Yeah, I always go back to this essay by A.K. Ramanujan called "Is There an Indian Way of Thinking?" In which he argues, that one of the hallmarks of the South Asian tradition and Indian thinking is context sensitivity. And he talks about the Mahabharata explicitly in this essay, that the Mahabharata is a context-sensitive epic, that it's trying to understand context by creating these kind of convoluted genealogies and really difficult situations. This is the exercise.
I feel like that idea of context sensitivity also relates to some of the sexual encounters that I was talking about in our main episode, where compared with Greek traditions of, again, just Zeus coming down and doing what he wants, there seemed to at least be some kind of
transaction,
some sort of thinking through of what the context is and how to deal with that, right? I wondered if we could think more about the way sex plays out in this text.
Yeah, and I mean, I think this negotiation, sex, procreation, and negotiation all go hand in hand in this. I mean, if we take, for instance, the character of Bhishma, who is the grandfather of the Pandavas and the Kauravas. Kind of. He's not really the grandfather.
Yeah, like biologically, he's nobody's grandfather, but he is nonetheless a grandfather.
Exactly. He's called grandfather in the text, even though he has no children or grandchildren. But basically what happens is that his father falls in love with another young woman. The young woman refuses to marry his father unless she gets a guarantee that her children will inherit the kingdom. So Bhishma, being the dutiful son, agrees to it. Then she has 2 children, neither of whom are able to produce heirs, but they do have wives. And then, in this moment of crisis, Bhishma's father's second wife comes to him and says, please, give children to these women. And he refuses because he says, I've taken a vow and I refuse.
It's quite beautiful, that passage in Satyamurti's translation, because this also struck me as an amazing moment. He says, my vow is more important to me than life itself. Sun may lose its brilliance, moon its luster, rain may withhold its blessing from the earth, fire may grow cold, and color colorless, before I will consent to break my word.
Exactly. And this is why he's called Bhishma. Bhishma isn't his name. Bhishma means awesome or terrifying. And he's awesome and terrifying because he is so strong in his vow of celibacy.
And it seems like he's contending with 2 separate forces that maybe, again, I don't know, maybe I'm using this wrong, but both seem like they could be what his dharma should be, which is to follow his vow or to provide heirs for his what is the relationship here? Is it his brothers, half-brothers, wives? Which is, something that's been tasked to him. Like, those are both things that he has an obligation to do. And now he has to figure out a way of navigating through both of these.
And again, like, you could say, dharmically, it would be to father children. But he chooses this other way. And then, interestingly enough, then the plan they have to get out of this is this idea of niyoga, I lever it. I don't know how you translate it, so that they get a Brahmin to come and impregnate the wives. But he's a forest ascetic. He's dirty. He's smelly. This is Vyasa, by the way. And then he comes in to impregnate the 2 women. And the first one finds him so repellent that she closes her eyes. And out of that is born a blind child, Dhritarashtra, the father of the Kauravas. And because of the laws of kingship and succession, he's technically not allowed to be the king because he's born blind. So then they decide to try again with the other daughter. They say, keep your eyes open. So she keeps her eyes open, but she just is so horrified that she turns pale. So Pandu, which literally means pale, is born from that. And so technically he also has, it's not clear if he should technically be king, but he is made king. And then
there's an extra one, right? From one of the maidservants.
Yeah, the maidservants gets the extra one, who is Vidra. Yeah.
And also, Bhishma shows up again in what I felt like it was kind of important that his death comes at the threshold as we move into the Bhagavad Gita. And am I right about that? Like, it seems like this bad news comes, and that's when we kind of flash back in Sanjaya's account to everything that had just happened on the battlefield.
On the battlefield, yeah. So Bhishma, because he's so, his vow is so strong, you gain something, by the way, by keeping a vow of asceticism. And this in Sanskrit is called tapas, which means like heat, but it's ascetic power, basically. And using that ascetic power, you can get all sorts of things, get boons or whatever. So Bhishma's boon is that he gets to choose the time of his death.
Oh.
And he has other things too, which get more and more interesting. But basically, then he's killed on the battlefield by Arjuna hiding behind a man who used to be a woman, Anyway, this is another long story that we can get into if you'd like, and shoots him full of arrows. He's so full of arrows that no part of his body can touch the ground. So he's kind of suspended above the earth. And it's lying on this, what is called the bed of arrows, that he gives the final teaching to Yudhishtira after the war about how to be a good king. So it's interesting that the guy who is never king is giving the teaching on how to be a king.
That's so neat. Well, since we're talking about the Bhagavad Gita section, one of the things I was wondering about, and the translation kind of flags it, but kind of doesn't. Like, I can tell where we come to the end of that section because it's it's a work on its own, but it's also an integral part of the Mahabharata. But it's not so easy to tell how you enter into it. Can you talk about like how you enter in and exit from it? And if you would read a little bit of it, that would be amazing. Because I thought it was incredibly beautiful in translation. I'd love to know how it sounds.
Well, I think it might be auspicious here to read in Sanskrit the first verse of the Bhagavad Gita, which is dharma kshetre kurukshetre samaveta yutsavaha mamaka pandavaschaiva kimakurvata sanjaya, which basically means on the field of dharma kshetre, on the field of the Kurus, kurukshetre, having come together, desiring to fight, my side and the Pandava side, what did they do, O Sanjaya? So it's basically it's a question of blind Dhritarashtra, who can't see what's going on, asking his charioteer, his helper, Sanjaya, who has been given the gift of divine sight, to explain what's going on here. So it's interesting that we automatically have it set up as something special happening on Kurukshetra, this battlefield where they are, which has now become the Dharma Kshetra, the field of Dharma. So that's the very first word of the Bhagavad Gita is, of course, Dharma. And I don't know, I find that rather beautiful. How this is set up, and that we're automatically kind of embedded within a story, within a telling, so that we have this theophany that's absolutely beautiful that you talked about earlier, that itself is already being part of the story that's being told up through us. So I find that rather beautiful.
And I love the way you call it like a field of dharma. I was so struck by the fact that we're in this kind of space, which is at once a site of spectacle, it's a battlefield, but it also feels like this really intimate space where just Arjuna and Krishna are there together. And also it's a physical space, but also we're located in time in a very strange way. So I really like the way you put that.
Yeah. And at the very beginning of this, it's Arjuna, the greatest warrior, the brave one. They use a word in Sanskrit, which is visharna. He like sinks down. He's despondent. We're this very despondent. He kind of takes his chariot out and sees the two arrayed armies, and he visharnas. He sinks down because he just doesn't know how he can possibly act. And then you're right. We have this kind of moment out of time in which there's this teaching of Krishna about what one should do, about death, about time, about how one approaches God. It's stunning that we have this expansive discussion that takes place almost like out of time, exactly right, before the storm of battle. And I find it very beautiful. And at one point, then, Krishna says to Arjuna, if you'll indulge me once more, he says, Yada yada hi dharmasya glanir bhavati bharata abhyutanam dharmasya tadatmanam srjamyaham, which basically means whenever dharma wanes and whenever there's a rising of adharma, then I emit myself, I create myself. And it's this beautiful moment when he reveals to his friend who he actually has been this whole time. And I find that rather beautiful.
Yeah, can you talk more about how Krishna works, this idea of being in the world, but also being a manifestation of Vishnu, but also being not just Vishnu, but being many things. There's this one moment, and I think it's not far from the passage that you were reading, where he says, of the female qualities, I am wisdom, constancy, prosperity, and patience. Of the deities, I am Vishnu, I am Rama, I am Shiva, I am Skanda, god of war. Of mountains, I am Meru, and goes on and on. I am that, he says. How does that work? Because that's so different from the ways of thinking about divinity that I'm familiar with.
Yeah, and I mean, this is something, the commentators on this, I mean, there's...
So they must go crazy with that.
They go crazy. I mean, there's so many commentaries in the Bhagavad Gita, so many different ways of understanding it. And, not to get into the theological weeds here, I think just at a really basic level, it's interesting how there is this, at least the Mahabharata at this point, puts in this eruption of the divine into the everyday world in terms of what is called an avatara. Now, avatar, people, use the word avatar or whatever all the time. And it's this idea that this divine avatar crosses down into the world. But then there's another meaning of avatar, which means a removing, a taking away of a burden. So there are these two kind of ideas here. One is that he's coming down into the world, and the other is that he's removing adharma, he's removing demons, he's removing evil from the world. So we have this very conscious idea of working in this divinity into this, as I was saying, this kind of absolute worst case scenario of total war, where almost everybody is arrayed to fight for this.
That's extremely beautiful.
Now, what's interesting, though, here is that I think that his version of Dharma, Krishna's version, is kind of interestingly opposed, or not opposed. Interestingly, it can be juxtaposed to Yudhishtira, the actual king. Like, how do you actually, though, work this out in real life? So we have these two kind of answers. One is the Bhagavad Gita, this sort of religious scriptural answer. And then the other is, the education of the Dharma king. Yudhishthira's education through the stories that Bhishma tells and through all of his experiences of fighting and surviving this war.
I'm curious, having heard you read a little bit of the Sanskrit original now. It sounded very alliterative. It sounded like there was a lot of playing with repetition of both consonants and vowels, actually. And I'm wondering if that's just a fluke because of the handful of lines that you picked, if that's sort of the sound of the original throughout, or if not, then what does this sound like in the original? What is the texture of the poetics of it?
I mean, I find it very beautiful. It's mostly written in 1 meter. Both of the verses I quoted were in the shloka meter, and that is found throughout, and it has a very rhythmical quality, and some of it has very high poetic construction. But yeah, you'll find this throughout. It's a very poetic and beautiful work. Is
it typical of other Sanskrit texts?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. There's a word called kavya in Sanskrit, which is the word for kind of beautiful, ornate poetry. And usually the Mahabharata is not considered to be a kavya, whereas the other great Sanskrit epic of South Asia, the Ramayana, is considered kavya. But I don't know. I have a soft spot for the Mahabharata, so I do find it incredibly beautiful.
Is that because of the poetic structure or something? Is that what makes it not inhabit that kind of role?
I'm not entirely sure. I'm not entirely sure why. I suppose the Ramayana is considered. I mean, the Ramayana is written in the same meter. It's another epic story, but traditionally the tradition puts the Ramayana as the Adi Kavya, the original Kavya.
It's interesting because none of the translations that I looked at seem to be focusing on that kind of aspect of capturing the poetic, the wordplay, the sound, anything like that. The Satyamurti's translation is very nice and very eloquent at times, but it isn't really trying to capture that kind of a poetics.
No.
So I was curious about how that played out in the original.
Yeah, and I think it's largely because the story or the stories, I should say, of this are the kind of focus. It's just so chock full of stories that it becomes this encyclopedia, as some people have said, of Hinduism or whatever you want to say. I think in all translations you have to make some sort of choices, and I think most people try to get the kind of feel of the stories rather than the feel of the Sanskrit, especially when you have to abridge so much.
No, fair enough. And there certainly are lots of fantastic stories within the Mahabharata, as we've been learning these last few weeks. I think we need to wrap up around here. So I want to thank you for coming and joining us and sharing a few more stories from this text with us.
Yeah, thank you so much. I feel like I've learned a lot.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This has been a delight to talk to you both about this.
Yeah, it's been great. Well, listeners, if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm, or we're on Twitter @the Spouter, and we'd always love to hear from you. Show notes with links for things that we've mentioned in this episode will be at megaphonic.fm/spouter/38b. And the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So until next time.
Until next time, thank you, Luthor, and see you again at the Spouter-Inn.